Thank you very much, Mr. D. And we will now to the Center for Security Policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank Stephen Blaney, Minister for Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Chairman Darrell Cramp, and the Committee for Public Safety and National Security for the opportunity to testify here today. We consider this to be a particularly auspicious time as Canada has recently shown itself an international leader in the effort to combat the global jihad movement. By way of introduction, the Center for Security Policy is an American national security think tank in Washington, D.C. that was founded in 1988 by former Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense Frank Gaffney. In the years since then, we have focused on the greatest security threats to America and our allies. My name is Claire Lopez, the Center's Vice President for Research and Analysis. I previously served as a CIA operations officer and later served in a variety of contract positions within the U.S. defense sector. I've also served as an instructor for military intelligence and special forces on terrorism-related issues, and I'm honored to mention my affiliation with the Board of Advisors for the Toronto-based Mackenzie Institute. My colleague is Kyle Scheidler. He's the director of our Threat Information Office, where he specializes in monitoring Sunni jihadist movements, most especially the Muslim Brotherhood. He has briefed congressional staff, intelligence, and federal law enforcement officials on the history, ideology, and operations of the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly their role in supporting terrorism activity. Recent devastating attacks by individual jihadis on Canadian soil demonstrate the critical need for better understanding of and appropriate tools to deal with the global jihad threat. Specifically, understanding that terrorism doesn't begin with the violent act itself, but rather with financing, indoctrination, and propaganda, and stopping these elements are key to stopping the attacks themselves. In particular, we applaud the decision to list as a terrorist entity the International Relief Fund for the Afflicted and Needy, an organization that was, according to available reports, engaged in financing the terrorist organization Hamas. We're hopeful that the Canadian law enforcement and security services will be able to use information gleaned through this investigation and subsequent investigations to further hamper terrorist efforts. It was also a Hamas terror financing case that provided U.S. law enforcement with information regarding the true depth of the threat posed to North America. In that case, the Holy Land Foundation trial, U.S. federal law enforcement uncovered voluminous secret documents representing the archives of the Muslim Brotherhood in North America. Thanks in part to the evidence provided by these documents, the Holy Land Foundation Hamas terror funding trial terror funding front was shut down, and prosecutors secured multiple convictions on terrorism financing charges. These documents come together to tell the story of a multi-decade-long effort by the Muslim Brotherhood in North America to establish itself, create front groups, seize control of mosques and Islamic centers, indoctrinate young people through youth organizations and Islamic schools, mislead the mass media, conduct intelligence operations against law enforcement and security services, and influence politicians. This carefully organized campaign of subversive activity forms the basis for what was called a grand jihad in eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within, in the Brotherhood's explanatory memorandum uncovered during the Holy Land Foundation case. There's been a tendency to divorce the physical manifestations of individual acts of Islamic terrorism, such as the recent attacks here in Canada, from the extensive support infrastructure provided by this global jihad movement. But the reality is that men and women do not seek to travel to fight in Syria or Iraq or engage in attacks domestically without first having been indoctrinated with an obligation to wage jihad. Such individuals have been instructed to put loyalty to a global Islamic ummah above loyalty to one's home country. They're educated to believe that Muslims have a right to impose Sharia, a foreign source of law, upon one's fellow citizens. All of these elements of indoctrination must occur before an individual would ever express interest in al-Qaeda or Islamic State propaganda. Providing the government an enhanced ability to target or take down propaganda that promotes a doctrinal command to wage jihad against unbelievers or the call to use force to overthrow the government and impose Sharia, in our judgment, would be beneficial, as it would help to disrupt indoctrination before individuals reach a stage at which they are considering attacks against a specific target. Laying this ideological groundwork is exactly the mission and the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has undertaken the mission to support movements engaged in jihad across the Muslim world, according to a Muslim Brotherhood document seized by Swiss law enforcement in 2001. Given this obligation to support, it is no surprise that terror recruits repeatedly have been traced back to an Islamic center, school, or mosque established or controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, as was the case in our own Boston Marathon bombing back in April 2013. Subsequently, organizations with ties to the Brotherhood have repeatedly sought to undermine and oppose counterterrorism strategies that rely on aggressive police and intelligence work to disrupt plots and arrest those responsible, the kind of strategy currently under discussion here in Canada. We've considered how these policies under discussion would help in Canada to address the common threat. It's necessary to address the whole host of activities which undermine the security of Canada, to include interfering with the capability of the government to conduct intelligence, defense, public safety, or other activities, or attempting to unduly change or influence the government by unlawful means, or to engage in covert foreign influenced activities. Likewise, address the full scope of jihadist operations, including indoctrination, propaganda, and subversive activities. It seems to us that these threats, such as these, emerging in the pre-attack phase of the jihadist campaign, are exactly the modus operandi of the Muslim Brotherhood, as it seeks to undermine constitutionally established Western governments, including that of Canada, to the benefit of the global jihad movement. We assess that legislation that would permit Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, to engage in actions to disrupt terror plots and threats to Canada would likely be effective in helping to thwart Islamic terror attacks in the pre-violent stage. Such a policy, provided due oversight, creates a necessary capability to intervene and undermine indoctrination and recruiting networks which lead individuals to become jihadists and either travel abroad to join jihadist groups or conduct attacks at home, even without a definite connection to any terrorist group. While we understand that there is a debate over how such capabilities could be overseen, the use of an intermediary review committee rather than direct parliamentary oversight has advantages when it is often the legislators themselves who are at risk of being targeted by these influence activities. There's already been controversy in the United States over an appointee to the U.S. Congressional House Select Committee on Intelligence, having received campaign funds from and having numerous associations with the Muslim Brotherhood-linked organizations in our country. Muslim Brotherhood organizations also have been aggressive in utilizing the media to target legislators engaged in oversight hearings, as well as threatening to fundraise for their political opponents if they dare to examine issues related to jihadist indoctrination in serious detail. In our opinion, any oversight committee dealing with these issues risks being an immediate target for similar efforts. Creating a buffer of intelligence professionals between CSIS and the members of Parliament may be useful, therefore, to preserve and protect important information, insulate MPs from aggressive influence operations to undermine their support for Canadian counterterrorism efforts, while also ensuring respect for civil rights and generating appropriate oversight that has a detailed understanding of the law enforcement and intelligence techniques involved. Certainly, it is to be expected that the Parliament would be vigilant in examining the reports generated by the Minister, and that it would take full advantage of opportunities to examine and discuss the reported data. In dealing with the threat posed by jihadist fighters living amidst our own communities, efforts have focused primarily on either methods to keep them from traveling abroad or revocation of passports to keep individuals from returning. The Center for Security Policy generally has been supportive of such measures, as currently are under discussion in the U.S. Congress, and that would take passports away from those who travel or seek to travel abroad to fight for terrorist forces. Likewise, changes and extensions to the current peace bond provisions here would appear to us to help to address substantial difficulty faced by counterterrorism agencies, which is that In numerous recent cases, we have seen that terrorists who perpetrated attacks in the U.S., Britain, France, and Australia have been what terrorism experts in the U.S. have begun to describe as known wolves. That is, rather than being undetected and operating without connection to other jihadist groups, a genuine lone wolf, what we're seeing instead is that most individuals identified as lone wolves, in fact, have had ties or at least a known proclivity to support jihadist ideology groups or terrorist networks, and frequently were already under some level of surveillance. It is thus not a lack of awareness, but rather an inability to take preventive action or disrupt the plot that all too often has resulted in these individuals successfully carrying out an act of Islamic terrorism. In conclusion, the Centre for Security Policy believes Canada is in a position to put into practice a forward-thinking approach that gives police officers and intelligence operatives the tools they need to not only surveil and detect terror threats, but to disrupt and dismantle the jihadist networks which seek to use terrorism as only one method among others to undermine and weaken the security of Canada. Thank you very much.
Earlier today we had Stephen Bushy from the Heritage Foundation present to committee, and he gave an outsider's perspective of what this legislation looks like, and he used the comments that it's a very good balance of ensuring security and protecting our freedoms. And I'm just wondering, I'll get you to expand on that, but I'm curious about one of the issues that you did address in your presentation, and that was your insight on oversight. And if you could expand a little bit more with your perspective on what this bill provides and our current regime.
Thank you. Well, as we have looked at the bill and reviewed it, obviously the oversight responsibility is an important one, and we have the same or similar kind of mechanism in our own Congress down in the United States for oversight of the intelligence and the security services of our country. So that remains a very important function of the Parliament to oversee the implementation of any kind of new measures like this for the security and safety in Canada. And I think from what we can observe, the measures of the bill under discussion would provide for that. And I think that is an important point. Kyle, do you want to add anything?
Well, I would just add our own view of having observed these sorts of situations in the United States has been the targeting of legislators who conduct oversight, who ask pointed questions. In the United States, we had a very detailed oversight discussion over the radicalization that occurs in prisons, and certain Congress members were very aggressively treated, both in the media but pointedly by organizations that are known to have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, known to have ties to terrorist organizations, and as a result, there becomes a reluctance to discuss issues that maybe need to get discussed. And so if you can create a barrier where the direct oversight is of, you did this right or you did this wrong is occurring at a committee level, and then you have a parliamentary level that can observe that security committee and make sure that the review that needs to be done is in fact being done, and that would be a positive in our view, because it would provide a level of protection to the legislator who is at risk of being targeted for influence operations.
Okay, so you're suggesting there would be potential risk with parliamentary oversight, as opposed to our current system, which has an independent review body that isn't. It reviews it after the fact, and it still holds our security agencies accountable to their actions, and they're still required to follow the warrants and the laws that we have in place here. We also have judicial oversight on an ongoing basis whenever a warrant is requested. It needs to get ministerial and judicial approval, and that's different than having partisan political oversight. And you would suggest that we have a good system.
I think that makes sense as you laid it out, yes.
Okay, good. One of the other things that you talked about in your testimony was the whole concept of preventing individuals from becoming indoctrinated, radicalized, and eventually becoming jihadis. What in this legislation exactly do you see would be a strength of fulfilling that?
It seemed to us as we reviewed it that there were new measures provided for in this bill that strengthened and really lengthened perhaps the review period before an individual inclined to jihad embarks on a course to an attack, a kinetic attack. And it provides for looking at statements. It looks at, the demonstration of a proclivity towards indoctrination to jihad before it actually completes or happens, so that the intelligence services and the police will have the ability to, with proper oversight again, but and respect for civil rights, but to take into account the behavior, the actions, the statements, maybe the online social media postings of an individual on the pathway to jihad, but before they actually get to the point of concocting a plot or, worse yet, carrying it out.
Mr. Blancy, 7 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you to the witnesses. I'd like to start with the Center for Security Policy. You mentioned that Canada has shown itself to be a global leader in fighting terrorism. And we thank you for that. We know Canadians are enormously proud that we're punching above our weight in fighting this threat. You mentioned that there are groups whose agenda is to mislead the mass media, to influence politicians, to undermine policies that are aimed to address terrorism, and to undermine Western governments. I'd like for you to expand on the who and the how of that.
We're referring specifically here to the network of the Muslim Brotherhood. That network spans both the United States and all of North America, including Canada, but also elsewhere in the world, certainly Western Europe, in terms of this kind of targeting of our society for infiltration and subversion from within. Whereas elsewhere we see jihadist organizations taking a violent or a kinetic approach to conducting attacks, explosions and murder. And these things are being targeted against our societies as well. With the Muslim Brotherhood, what we're seeing is that there is a calculated program to infiltrate society in different spheres. In other words, we're talking about academia, we're talking about government at different levels, both the legislature of our countries, but also the senior serving and appointed members of government, the media certainly, and throughout society. And that has been the modus operandi of the Brotherhood and its various groups. Now, we know that quite a number of those groups operate throughout North America, United States, as well as Canada. Among those would be those listed on the Muslim Brotherhood's own explanatory memorandum, last page, which was one of those documents presented as evidence in our own Holy Land Foundation trial. And on that list, which the Brotherhood titles Our Friends and the Organizations of Our Friends, quite helpful them, were organizations like CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, ISNA, Islamic Society of North America, ICNA, Islamic Circle of North America, NAIT, N-A-I-T, North American Islamic Trust, which, by the way, holds the deeds of trust to over or around 80% of all mosques and Islamic centers in the United States. These are some of the organizations I'm talking about.
Just this week, media reported that there's new military intelligence showing that the D&D here in Canada is monitoring constant threats made against Canadian Armed Forces members and their families from ISIL terrorists on social media. I wonder if you could comment on any knowledge you have of this type of activity.
Well, certainly we've seen reports like these of targeting against American troops also using social media. We know that the Islamic State is extremely sophisticated, very knowledgeable about the use of the internet and specifically social media for the propaganda, indoctrination, and indeed threat, activities that they engage in. I might turn to my colleague to expand on this a little bit because that's an area that he works very closely in.
Very recently, we've seen, as you mentioned in Canada and also in the United States, the so-called Islamic State hacking organization, which released a list of names that they claimed that they had stolen from the Department of Defense computers. The reality was that they had conducted open source intelligence, a system typically called doxing in hacker speak, to gather up the names, locations, social media identities of members of the armed forces. They have also used this technique to target Arab allies flying combat missions against the Islamic State, and also against individuals that they alleged to be members of the Israeli intelligence service. To date, I'm unaware of any case where the Islamic State has successfully targeted an individual on the basis of this list. But certainly once that list has been created and published, it will be considered acceptable, authentic, and legitimate for any supporter of the Islamic State to act against an individual. And I would absolutely expect that they will attempt to do that. If you look at the situation that occurred in Paris with the attack on the magazine Charlie Hebdo, that was a case where those individuals had been threatened many, many years in advance, and it was some time later, but eventually they were indeed targeted.
In your view, are there measures in this bill that would help to contain and push back against the kind of threats we've just been discussing?
I do. I think creating opportunities to prevent or disrupt, opportunities to conduct aggressive counterintelligence, for example, to try and get in and collect the names of ISIS supporters, for instance, before they strike. Something to that nature would be one method of disrupting and preventing. And I think that from our reading, what's being discussed would permit that kind of activity, I think, and it would be useful.